Breaking news from Fox Sports.
Doug, it is with a very heavy heart that I announce that Pro Football Hall of Famer Jim Brown has died at the age of 87. This news just coming through via the Associated Press within the last couple of minutes. Civil rights advocate, actor, and again, legendary football player Jim Brown has died at the age of 87.
In any conversation of the greatest athlete in American history, you can have Jim Brown. Remember, now he's a three-time MVP of the NFL, and of course was an all-time great at Syracuse. But I believe he was an All-American lacrosse player too, wasn't he? Right?
Yes.
He played basketball, he ran track, and he was in lacrosse. He played basketball at Syracuse and averaged 15 a game. He placed fifth in the national championship decathlon, and he was a second-team All-American. In lacrosse his junior year, the same year he averaged 11 points a game on the basketball team. He was so dominant that they changed the lacrosse rules. That's a real thing. How is he the sixth overall selection of the Cleveland Browns, by the way? He made those five other teams pay. And he broke the single season record. Remember, it was a 12-game season. 12-game season. In 1958, he rushed for 1,527 yards. You do the math. And if you want to know the level of dominance of Jim Brown, okay, when he set the mark, again, 12 games, 1,527 yards. The previous mark was held by Steve Van Buren. It had been only 9 years, right? The previous mark for most yards for a season in a 12-game season was 1,146 yards, right? So he beat it by more than 400 yards. He had 17 touchdowns in one season, which was a record. The closest to that record that year was 8 by Raymond Berry, another Hall of Famer for the Baltimore Colts. Then he retired early, and when he retired, he held the single season and career rushing records, as well as the all-time leader in rushing touchdowns. Remember, this is only 9 years, 12 games, 106 touchdowns. He was the first player to reach the 100 rushing touchdowns milestone, and few others have done it since. And by the way, when he retired, then he became an actor, and he's many people I think now are much more aware of not just his political stances, how he was a civil rights advocate, and in the 1980s and 90s, he was the guy who the Crips and the Bloods went to kind of calm the gang wars in Los Angeles.
What a life.
I mean, what a freaking life. What a freaking life. And my dad used to, I don't know what your parents used to do on Saturdays sometimes with nothing going on, like once you get past hoop season, you couldn't watch, or the NBA game was over for the day. My dad used to listen to, and I still have them, Richard Pryor albums, LPs. And Richard Pryor was close friends with Jim Brown. And he tells the story of, like, he had a rubber brick, and he threw a rubber brick at Jim Brown when Jim Brown was walking up his walkway. And he tells, Pryor was an incredible storyteller. And he's like, that brick is midair. And you're like, I hope that brick ain't real. And Jim Brown ain't flinching anyway. But an incredible life. In any conversation of the greatest American athlete in the history of our country, you have to at least put him in that conversation. And in any conversation, the greatest running back. Because you can't contextualize. That's why it's important to realize, okay, what does he look like versus Barry Sanders? Versus what does he look like versus Walter Payton? What does he look like versus Marshall Faulk, right? So you can't, because totally different time, era, sport. But think about that. In a 12-game season, not only did he rush for over 1,527 yards, but the record he broke was 9 years old, and it was 1,117 yards. That's crazy. Mark Dominic joins us on the Doug Gottlieb Show on Fox Sports Radio. Jim Brown just passed away. And I was trying to convey to people, and look, we're about the same age, right? You're a little bit older than me. And so most of what we're dealing with Jim Brown is lore. But is it fair to say any conversation about the greatest running back and maybe greatest athlete in the history of American sports has to at least have Jim Brown in it?
I do think that that's part of the conversation. I certainly agree with the thought of one of the greatest running backs of all time, if not the greatest running back of all time. And the only way I can judge it is, Doug, is, you know, I've gone back and looked at old film just because I couldn't help myself to kind of say, like, what was it like? And if you have the chance to ever go back and look, it's shockingly like Men Against Boys. I mean, the way he was so powerful, so strong. Again, I'm 52. I never saw him play live, but I went back and watched film on him because I was kind of curious. Like the greats, you kind of want to go back and take a peek at what made him so great. He had unbelievable balance and just pure strength. And so, you know, when we talk about, like, and I thought you did a good example, you know, Marshall Faulk or Barry Sanders or Walter Payton, you know, they all had different running styles. Jim Brown, he could run through you as much as he could run around you.
Yeah.
And just was a beast and a brute, and just and then also just a real gentleman as well. And so, you know, an icon of pro football, but absolutely, it's kind of like, who's the greatest defensive end of all time? I don't know. Who's the great, you know, but I could give you some names. If you want to talk about running back, if you don't mention Jim Brown, then you don't know football history.
Right. Yeah, that's my late father said. He said that exact same thing about Jim Brown. Like, he was, some guys could run over you, some guys could run around you and run by you. He could do both. He could do both. And, you know, a lot of these guys say they're leaving the sport for some greater cause. Yes, he went into acting, but he actually did leave the sport for a greater cause. Like, there actually was a reality to it. He actually did what he said he was going to do. This is Jim Brown from his A Football Life on the NFL Network.
I'll tell you why I'm the way that I am. It doesn't start on the field. It starts as a person. I was dealing with race since I was born. And in my inner self, my strength was unbending when it came to accepting that BS, racial discrimination, because I was never going to let anybody make me feel that I was not top shelf. And that was the battle that raged, and I could use a lot of that on the field.
Yeah, there's the famous, and again, I'm getting to the, Richard Pryor had this famous bit about him where he said, you know, Jim Brown was rushed for 200 yards when they wouldn't block for him, and they'd step on his hand, and he'd just get up and say, that's going to cost you 100 more yards, right? So a breakthrough athlete, an amazing story. Are you a Dirty Dozen guy, John Ramos? You're our cinephile. You a Dirty Dozen guy?
Yes, that's a very, very good movie. Lee Marvin and, of course, Jim Brown. Very good movie. Clint Eastwood was in that as well, I think.
He was?
Or I think that's where the Eagles Dare. That's a different movie. So, but yeah.
Yeah, the Dirty Dozen was not. I don't think Clint Eastwood was in that one.
No, I don't. I think it was Where the Eagles Dare. Was a Clint Eastwood movie.
I don't think Eastwood was in that one.
Lee Marvin. Like, I knew Lee Marvin from that movie, and then Paint Your Wagon. But the Clint Walker, not Clint Eastwood. You get the wrong Clint in that movie.
I think it was Clint Walker in that.
Have you seen
it right, John? Get your Clint
Buyer,
right.
have you seen, honest, and this is not, have you ever seen Dirty Dozen?
No.
What about you, Jay Stu?
I've never watched it. No, I know of it.
Considered one of the all-time great movies. Considered by many people.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, you know about it. If you live and you pay attention, you know about the movie and the references. I just have never consumed it. You know, kind of like the Smiths in music. You know,
didn't somebody from the Smiths die today? You tweeted about?
No, Andy Rourke, their bassist, passed away. Sadly to say, I hate that. You know, and that kind of leads me to one of my pet peeves. Whenever two people die within a short window, you always hear that whole thing. You know, they say they die in threes. And the third one's always a stretch. You know, it's always like, okay, if we have to make this cliche work, we'll just kind of fit it in there.
Andy Rourke was only 59 years old. What did he die from?
Cancer.
Yeah. That's terrible. That's terrible. I'll tell my daughter. You know, my daughter's a big bassist. She knows all of them.
But along those lines, I think we had this conversation on this show at some point. We were talking about Raquel Welch. You know, when he did that movie with her and did a love scene with her, that was like groundbreaking. It was like shocking to our society that there was a mixed race love scene. It was quite a groundbreaking moment in cinema.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I'm fully aware that I grew up in a place. You and I grew up in a place, and Ramos too, where I think race in California in the 80s and 90s, obviously when you had the riots, but that was more police and the treatment of black people and abusive police, or some of the stuff we saw a couple summers ago. But in terms of our own racial kind of relationships with people, it's always been much more homogenous in California. Like I moved in California in 81, but did you guys know that like marrying somebody of another race was illegal until I think the 70s, wasn't it? Like, that's just crazy. It's like insane. That really happened. But Jim Brown he's one of those guys where, you know, do I know he would have been like a great running back in this era? I don't know, but he checks every box for a more athletic Derrick Henry. Right? He was like 6'2", 230. And if you think, well, you know, they didn't catch the ball in the backfield, like, well, he was a basketball player and he played lacrosse. So he obviously had incredible hand-eye coordination. It wasn't just an incredible specimen, and he would run through you, run around you. Like, he checks up all the boxes, a guy that would be good in any era. Any era. And then he walked away only 9 years in, right? And how about the fact that he was a first-team All-Pro 8 years, in his 9th? That's incredible.
I saw a note where he's the first or the only non-quarterback to win 3 MVPs.
In 1962, his career high in receptions that year, 47th, Doug. That was tied for 18th in the entire league.
He had 47 catches, and that was 18th?
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, like, this is like he didn't catch the ball a ton, but he caught the ball more than any other running back, and stands to reason that he would evolve pretty good, right, in this era. Yes,
yeah. There was only one other running back who caught more passes in the league, so he could do that skill.
Here's a question. Who's the great football player of a previous era who you're like, I kind of wish I saw him so I could get it more. Like Jim Brown's probably that guy. Like, I kind of wish I would have seen it live to totally get it. Anybody else have, like, honestly?
Deacon Jones.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even think we appreciate like how good Reggie White was. I think we're so in love with Lawrence Taylor.
Yes.
And now you look back at Reggie White highlights. Not that he didn't get his acclaim, but I just, when we're talking about, I just think when you're talking about quarterback sacks, LT is such a freak. But to hear those guys talk about Deacon Jones, that would be the one that I would want to see.
One guy I think that you're a huge fan of is Steve Largent, right? And
yes.
Who would Steve Largent be Cooper Kupp today?
Gosh, it's funny because I just think the offenses are so catered towards the wide receiver, and I don't think that tons were catered towards Steve Largent. So I'm trying to almost find a way where talking about squeezing out that orange, of what the Seahawks got with that, but that could be. He wasn't as big play as Cooper Kupp was in the run after the catch, I would think. So,
what about you, Jay Stu? Is there a older football player you wish you would have seen to get a clearer perspective on what everybody's talking about?
Yeah, I think Gale Sayers is that guy.
Oh, that's a good one.
I think didn't he what did he do? He did like 6 times in a game. He scored a touchdown. I think like 4 of them were kickoffs or something ridiculous like that. Yeah, he was a kickoff returner / running back. Only played a couple. He's kind of like the Sandy Koufax of the NFL. Like,
well, really bad knee injury, right?
Yeah,
really bad knee injury, and that was back before they could really fix knees when you had catastrophic knee injuries. But Brian's song also kind of made him resonate. What about you, Ramos?
I would say for me, Dick Butkus. That would be somebody that
it's a good one.
Obviously a great player, Hall of Famer, and kind of began the whole linebacker thought pattern. I'd kind of like to see. My understanding is those guys were just like vicious. Like there was no rules whatsoever, right? It was just like they come across and like cut you with their arms, like they're just like your head, and it was just pretty brutal back then. So Dick Butkus would be my choice.
Mine would be Fran Tarkenton. Because he feels like a modern era quarterback playing back in that era, right? Where he could run, he could throw, he could make people miss. Like I've heard so many people talk about Fran Tarkenton, like, oh, Fran Tarkenton. Like I would those old quarterbacks. I would love to love like you go kind of through them. Johnny Unitas. Honestly, like I don't feel like I got. When I loved Marino, I was a Marino guy back in the day, but I'm not sure people have a great appreciation for Dan the Man.
They don't. He never had a running back.
Now, here's a question about Dan the Man. Did he not have a running back because he didn't want to have a running back?
There's something to that, yeah.
And he was so slow that you couldn't really put him under center, right? So he had to be out of the shotgun. But, like, dude, he used to get it and zip it. Clayton and Duper. I think Jim Kelly's much the same way because he didn't win a Super Bowl. But I think Dan Marino and Jim Kelly, those guys, and of course there's a connection there with Jim, both from Western Pennsylvania. Jim Kelly played at Miami, and of course Marino was the quarterback of the Dolphins. But yeah, they didn't really have a great defense, and they didn't have a running game. But they were out there slinging, like how people play now, that's how they played then.
It's funny because nowadays, Doug, it seems like all we hear about, and we heard it with Lamar Jackson too, is we're going to build our offense around the quarterback, right? That's what we hear a lot about now. Everything's going to be built around you. When you talk about Dan Marino, and Jason just made a good point, I'm not sure if they tried to build the team so much around the quarterbacks back then. Like maybe if Dan Marino was built around him, maybe they would have won the Super Bowl at some point during his career, or Jim Kelly, even though they had Thurman Thomas. I mean, he was, and Andre Rison, who's a Hall of Famer, Andre Reed, who's a Hall of Famer,
and what's his name, Smith on the other side.
Yeah, but I don't know.
They had dudes on defense. I mean, they went to 3 straight Super Bowls. They had an offense and a defense that ran the K gun. I don't know. I would. And they definitely built it around Dan Marino, huh?
Yeah, 4 straight Super. Are you talking about the Bills?
Yeah,
Bills,
the
4
Bills.
straight Super Bowls. And the Dolphins, though they only got to 1 Super Bowl, they were always in the playoffs.
They were actually a defensive team before Marino took over. They had the Killer Bees defense, and David Woodley was their quarterback when they lost to Washington in the Super Bowl. Then Marino ends up taking over the next year as a rookie, and they were really good. The Seahawks actually knocked them off in the playoffs that year, and then Marino's second year they go to the Super Bowl, but they're actually a defensive, they had a good defense when prior to Marino's time there.
The 2 greatest Monday Night Football games I can ever remember was when they beat the Bears in '85, and then Favre when his dad died. But like, do you guys remember that game at the old Orange Bowl? And the Bears, the Bears did not lose a game the rest of the year. The Bears in the Super Bowl against the Patriots, like the only controversy was they didn't give the ball to Walter Payton to score a touchdown. Like the rest of the game meant nothing about it at all. They were completely dominant. But one Monday Night Football game, Dan the Man Marino, Mark Duper, Mark Clayton, they ended up beating them.
That is, and it's interesting because I wonder what Marino's legacy would have been if they would have beat New England, because they lost in the AFC Championship game.
Sure.
And I don't think we talk about that one as much as maybe we should. We just talk about their win in the regular season. But if we would have had that rematch, and that would have been I mean, we still reference Super Bowl 20 because of the dominance, but you talk about the great matchups to have that rematch of what could have been.
What a crappy Patriots team, too.
Yeah.
They really choked that AFC title game away. Steve
Was it in the snow?
Grogan?
Grogan. Yeah.
Grogan.
No, it was
Was it
in
in the
Miami.
Yeah, he
They
didn't even
lost at
start
home.
that game. It was Tony Eason that was their quarterback,
Johnny
remember?
Eason.
Grogan
Yeah.
played like the last quarter because they were down by so many points.
All of this, by the way, if you're just joining us, you're like, why are they? We're talking about Jim Brown passing away, and we're talking about, this is our childhood, right? This is when we're all 85. I was 9, right? It's like your formative years. Dan, you were like 6, right?
I'm only a year younger than you, so yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So you're like 8. I was 9. Ramos was 23.
I was 15.